Hi there, I'm Katie Cameron. I'm Outreach Officer at the M&S Company Archive in Leeds. I want to talk to you about the Reminiscence work we do with older people and people with dementia, and how over the 5 years that we've been running the programme, I've developed the way I communicate with participants, including both the language that I use and the methods of conveying information. Firstly, it might be useful to have a bit of background about the archive and our Reminiscence programme. So the M&S Company Archive opened in 2012 in our purpose-built home in Leeds, so we're on the university campus in Leeds. The collection holds over 72,000 items telling the story of M&S, and this includes everything from merchandise sold over the last 135 years, business documents, marketing materials, lots of photographs documenting stores, staff and products. And at any one time, a small selection of the archive is on display in our permanent exhibition. There's a photograph there. And researchers can book into the reading room to look at the collection in more detail. So the idea of the archive was to make the collection as accessible as possible to members of the public, whether that be general visitors, researchers, school groups, students, M&S colleagues and former colleagues, as well as community groups. When the archive opened, some sporadic community activities took place, but it was in 2015 when we began a more formal programme aimed at older people, people with dementia, whether that was care home residents, day centre attendees or older people living at home. The archive collection is perfect for reminiscence, so even if people don't have an M&S specific memory, though many people do, they can still be inspired by the vintage fashions, popular foods of their childhood, old photographs of their area or newsworthy events that might be covered in our staff magazines. I have to say the photographs of 50s, 60s and 70s fashion are always the most popular when it comes to starting conversations with the sessions. Using the collection as a starting point, we started to think about what we could do to offer more to groups, residents in care homes and memory cafes and so on. So we began offering free memory box loans. The boxes contained original archive objects as well as replicas, and lots of guidance for care home staff or memory cafe volunteers to be able to run their own reminiscence sessions. We started an outreach service, so I would visit local care homes and day centres with a memory box and run a reminiscence session there. For a couple of years we ran a monthly on-site memory cafe where attendees would look at archive objects and then create crafts inspired by what they'd seen, and of course enjoyed lots of tea and cake. We also tailor exhibition visits for community groups, so really thinking about what each individual group needs and helping them get the most out of their visit. And as well as that, we run annual, more in-depth projects. So we try to run these more in-depth projects annually. It means that every year a group get to spend a bit longer in the archive. Usually they have a session a week for around 2 months, and they can look in more detail at archive material. And the group then have the opportunity to make a creative response inspired by the archive material that they've seen. So for example, we've done projects on looking at textiles and prints and patterns in the archive, and the group then went on to create a collaborative textile piece. Sparking Memories was an intergenerational project. The What We Ate project looked at food archives, and the group then created a food-inspired textile piece. And then more recently, the Stories from M&S Sheet Music project looked at sheet music in the archive and music and how that helped people with dementia and the creative process. I'll talk more about a couple of these projects later, as they've been really useful in helping me to develop my communication skills with these audiences. So before starting our outreach programme, I'd had very little experience of working with people with dementia. And I wanted to ensure that what we would be offering would be useful, effective, interesting for participants and helpful for carers and families as well. I started with the basics, so I arranged a dementia-friendly session to be held at the archive so that the whole team could participate and we could all gain more knowledge about dementia. It gave us an understanding, a really useful understanding of the effects of dementia, and helped us to start thinking about how we could put the archive collection to best use. I then had the opportunity to take part in a more in-depth dementia awareness training day, which gave more information on the medical aspects of dementia. But this also really helped when trying to understand the condition and the links to reminiscence therapy. I was also really lucky that as we were starting our programme, the ARA held some Reminiscence in the Archives training, which included a really practical session on using archives for reminiscence. You can find links to these training resources and some other training sessions on the separate document. All this training and research was really valuable. It gave me really useful theories and ideas to start building my practice. It also helped with building my confidence to go out and do it. However, what I found really built my confidence was simply doing it. So we began offering outreach sessions, as I mentioned, to care homes and day centres. I'd take a box of archive documents, objects, garments, and sit with a group of participants. We'd pass objects around and talk about them. Usually I'd hold up an object and introduce it and then hand it round for the group to touch and talk about. The format would change depending on the group, their needs and their physical abilities and the room setup. And when thinking about using archive objects as conversation starters and running these reminiscence sessions, I think the Alzheimer's Society communication guidelines are a really useful tool that can be applied to our work. The link to the guidelines is in the resource list, but I've highlighted a few here, the ones that were most useful to me. So firstly, and obviously, I mean, this sounds really obvious, but make sure that you're in a good place to communicate, ideally quiet and calm with good lighting. I suppose this is the same really for all groups and visitors, and you would always assess the needs and requirements of any group that will come into your archive, but it helps to think about the environment. For example, I make sure that there's no school groups booked in at the same time, so it helps with noise levels and helps the group concentrate and be present in the place at the time. Listen carefully to what the person is saying, so this active listening can help improve communication. It sounds so basic, but a lot of the time it's easy to let your mind wander when you're listening to someone. Practicing active listening with your participants can help you create meaningful responses to what they're saying. And actually, this idea of active listening I found really useful in general day-to-day conversations that I have. Allow the person plenty of time to respond, so it may take them longer to process the information and to work out their response. You might find that others in the group try to help or offer answers or suggestions, but if you're one-on-one with the person, you can help reassure them. Try not to interrupt the person, even to help them find a word. It can break their pattern of communication and break their thought process. Don't be afraid of silence and just waiting and listening, and you can reassure the person that there's no rush as well. If the person is upset, let them express their feelings. So this is a really interesting one, and one that I found quite difficult at the start. Allow the person the time they need and try not to just dismiss their worries. Sometimes the best thing to do is just listen and show that you're there. In a recent session, for example, a lady that I was talking to began to become upset when a piece of music that we were listening to reminded her of her husband, who was no longer with us. We started talking about her husband and his job, where they got married and about their children. And by the end of the session, she was happy that she'd been able to share all those memories with us. So don't be afraid of people's emotions. The person that you're talking to will always have a carer or relative there. So there'll always be the support there for the person that you're talking to. And then don't talk to the person as you would to a child. Be patient and have respect for them. This tone of voice and the way that you talk to people is, again, for me, it was something that came with running the sessions and the more experience I got, the more confident I felt about it. It's important not to underestimate participants when introducing an archive object. Just because that person might not communicate very much doesn't mean they're not listening or understanding or enjoying what you're saying. So maybe start with the basic information about an object or document and then build on it. But there's no reason why that person with dementia wouldn't be as interested in the details of an object as any other visitor. And I've learnt lots from participants at sessions who have told me things that I didn't know about the objects that I've shared. So, the learning can be a two-way process. Try to communicate with the person in a conversational way rather than asking question after question, which may feel quite tiring or intimidating. This is something that I learned from the ARA training that I found really useful. So try not to ask questions such as, do you remember? Which can be challenging and can also put the person on the spot. So do you remember wearing a garment like this? Or do you remember this event? So, for example, if you were looking at a photograph of models wearing 1960s fashions, rather than saying, do you remember wearing a dress like this? I might say, what do you think of these colours? Or when might you wear an outfit like this? Or do you enjoy shopping? It doesn't matter if the participant shares a specific memory about what they wore in the 60s. It's more that you're using that photo as a tool to start a conversation. That's any conversation, really. And then don't worry if the conversation goes off topic. So, for example, I might show the participants at a session a 1920s ledger with the expectation of talking about how much money was spent on various things by the business. But I wouldn't be surprised if the group started talking about the texture of the leather cover, for example, or handwriting lessons at school, or how heavy the book is. We recently ran a session about love and romance, and one of the participants was talking about meeting his wife at a local dance. But the conversation soon turned to a lady whose son was in hospital, and then another chap was telling us that he'd spent 2 years in hospital after falling off a corrugated roof on his allotment. So the conversation really strayed, but those sorts of conversations should be encouraged. Including the person in conversation with others, it's important not to speak as though they're not there. Being included can help them keep their sense of identity and know that they're valued. It can also help them feel less excluded or isolated. If a participant has more advanced symptoms of dementia, ensure that you're still sharing the archive object with them. I've found touch to be really valuable where words might not seem appropriate. So with permission, I might help the participant to touch the fabric of a garment or the plastic of a record, but then wouldn't necessarily expect a response from that. These initial outreach sessions gave me an important lesson that no group or participant will be the same. So I wouldn't know the levels of dementia that the group had until I got there, or the level or quality of staff input, or which room I'd be in, or the facilities available. I soon realised that there's no one-size-fits-all option for a group or an individual. And I realised that you can't assume that one method of communication will work with all, and you have to be ready to change your plan. However, the more sessions that I ran, the more I felt equipped to deal with the unexpected, and it really doesn't matter if you deviate from your plan. The important thing is that the participants are having a meaningful experience. The issue of the unknown is also present when working on a longer term project, where you might assume that you would have the same group of people every day. So, for example, I ran a creative reminiscence project in 2016 called Creative Sparks, one of these longer term projects. Residents from a local care home spent 9 weeks exploring the archive and creating artwork inspired by what they'd seen, and the finished work went on display to the public at the archive. Each week the group would take a closer look at archive objects, and with the help of an artist they were guided through techniques from batik and needle felting to tie-dye and silk painting to create a collaborative final piece. The objects inspired memories, which in turn inspired the creative process, and as well as reminiscing, the group learned new skills and built new friendships. From a very practical point of view, we learned that although we may have felt like we bonded as a group and individuals after the first session, by the next week it was often like starting again. The same attendees may not come every week. They may just decide on the day that it's too rainy or that they feel too tired. And at the same time, even if the same people do attend, their mood and level of understanding can change from week to week, even hour to hour during a session. Saying this, it's important not to overthink it, and as I said earlier, be prepared to change plans and make no assumptions about the individuals with the group. It's also important, I found, to try not to be disheartened when a person that you may have had a really interesting or funny conversation with one week doesn't remember you or the conversation the next week. What's important is that that person at the time was in the moment and was taking part in that exchange with you, and it will have had benefits for them at the time. If you'd like to find out more about the Creative Sparks projects, just click on the link to the short film. Depending on your setting, group sessions may or may not be successful. I found that when attending a memory cafe or a day centre where people are living with dementia that is less advanced, the group sessions can work really well. So for example, the picture here shows a local memory cafe where people attend from the local community. The attendees enjoyed group conversations across the tables and sharing their experiences with the rest of the group. The people in this group felt comfortable and they were in familiar surroundings. It gave them the confidence to do that. However, it's often the case that some people feel more happy speaking to just one person or in smaller groups. With the Creative Sparks project that I mentioned earlier, we were lucky that we had excellent support from the care team. So it's always obviously really important to involve the care team and any carers or relatives when you're doing these sessions. But we began each session sat in a group, passing objects around for discussion. But then within that group, there would always be people who didn't enjoy or didn't feel comfortable talking in front of other people. So having members of the care team around the room meant that one-on-one chats could take place, ensuring that everybody had an enriching session. And as an aside, I found that an effective activity when you're faced with a group who are maybe less confident talking as a group was a storytelling activity. So after looking at archive objects, we wrote a group story with participants suggesting the next sentence. This meant that people can contribute if they want to. Others might be more happy to just sit and listen to the story building. Although we've been talking about communication with participants, I started thinking about the language we use when talking to any stakeholders involved in a project or session, and how we can ensure that colleagues, freelancers or volunteers are comfortable in supporting sessions. So another project that we had, we ran a 2-month programme where participants listened to recordings of sheet music held in the archive, and then helped by a practitioner. They wrote poems or stories and had other creative responses to the music and related archive objects. One team member was unsure about the week themed around dancing, and that some participants who could no longer stand or move around independently might become upset as the objects would remind them of what they couldn't do. So together we discussed the potential outcomes of the session and how, even if it might be a difficult subject for some, it was a huge part of many people's lives that was important to explore. But everybody needed to be happy with the content of the session before we proceeded. The session ended up with, it was the most lively and enjoyable session of the whole programme. There's more details of this project again at the link to the short film. It's called Stories from Sheet Music. Another example of the importance of sharing information with colleagues and others involved in a project comes from an intergenerational programme we ran called Sparking Memories. Students from a local college met up with residents in a local care home every week for 2 months. They looked at objects from the archive and they shared skills when it came to the creative elements of the project. I found it really interesting that the younger people perhaps didn't have the same preconceived ideas about talking to people with dementia. They were more relaxed with participants and able to talk in a more natural conversational way. The other benefit of this approach was the opportunity for more one-to-one activity, and this proved incredibly valuable for both the participants and the students. And again, there's more information about this in the link to the short film. So how do you know if the way you're communicating and the language you're using is effective? We've used a variety of evaluation techniques across projects to try to ensure that we're delivering the most useful, interesting resources possible. The piano project, for example, was part funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, so we enrolled the help of a freelance evaluator who sat in on sessions. She spoke to carers and participants and produced a formal report. For other sessions, I've had informal discussions with both participants and carers, whether that's relatives, day centre or care home members of staff, to discover how they feel a session went or if it could be improved. I've used more formal feedback forms that were mainly intended for carers or relatives to complete, and I've used dementia-friendly evaluation resources for participants to use, so simple flashcards with smiley, neutral and sad faces on them can be useful in some settings, but it really depends on your group and your evaluation requirements. For me, the most useful feedback is gathered in the moment when participants or carers can react instantly to an activity or session, but it can be difficult to quantify this. This, combined with a mix of quantitative data collected via questionnaires completed by support staff and facilitators and observations, has helped me develop the way I communicate with groups and individuals. And that brings us to the end of my thoughts around language and communication when working with people with dementia and older people. I hope some of this information is useful, but do get in touch if you have any questions. My email address is on the screen.